The scent of stale champagne and another woman's perfume clung to the silk sheets, a ghost in the morning light. Eleanor Hayes traced the rim of her coffee cup, the porcelain cold against her skin, a stark contrast to the fire igniting in her gut. While her husband, Richard, the titan of tech, was tangled in the limbs of his latest conquest, she was preparing to dismantle his kingdom. He thought he was breaking her heart. He had no idea she was about to break his empire. The papers were signed, the deal was done, his company was now hers. The silence in their penthouse was a living entity. It breathed in the sterile air, circulated by a climate control system that hummed a constant, monotonous tune. It was a silence Eleanor had grown accustomed to, a silence that spoke volumes more than Richard ever did. From their perch on the 80th floor, New York City sprawled below, a glittering, indifferent beast. She used to find the view romantic, a testament to their shared ambition. Now, it just felt like a long way to fall. Eleanor ran a hand over her burgeoning belly, a gentle protective gesture. 6 months. 6 months carrying their son, a child conceived in a rare moment of what she had mistaken for rekindled intimacy. It was after the successful launch of Aura, Richard's revolutionary augmented reality glasses, a project she had named. He had come home that night, eyes shining with victory, and for a few hours he was the man she had married, not the cold, distant CEO he had become. The illusion, like most things in their life, was short-lived. Her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling window was a stranger's, the bespoke maternity dress, a soft cashmere in a shade of dove gray, couldn't hide the exhaustion etched around her eyes. She had once been a force in her own right, a sharp, intuitive art curator with a reputation for spotting genius before the world did. She had given it all up, convinced by Richard that his dream was big enough for both of them. "We're a team, Elle," he'd said, his hand on her cheek, his voice a velvet trap. "I build the empire, you make it beautiful." And so she had. She'd transformed their sterile apartments into homes, hosted flawless dinner parties for investors, and smoothed over Richard's social awkwardness with her innate grace. She was the perfect corporate wife, an asset as valuable as any patent he owned. But an asset, she was learning, could be depreciated. The signs had been there for months, small tremors before the earthquake, the late nights at the office that stretched into dawn, the hushed phone calls he'd take on the terrace, the city lights dancing in his glasses while his back was turned to her. The scent of a perfume that wasn't hers, a floral note too sweet, too cloying for her own minimalist tastes. He'd called her paranoid, a side effect of pregnancy hormones. He was so convincing, his gaslighting so subtle, that she had almost believed him. Almost. The final, irrefutable proof had come not from a private investigator, but from a misplaced company tablet. Richard was careless, a flaw born of arrogance. He believed he was untouchable, that the rules of mere mortals didn't apply to him. The tablet left on the kitchen counter had been synced to his personal accounts, a series of messages, explicit and damning, with his executive assistant, Chloe Vance. They weren't just planning meetings, they were planning a future that didn't include Eleanor or their unborn child. The discovery hadn't shattered her, it had forged her. The pain was a physical thing, a shard of ice in her chest, but beneath it, something else was taking shape. A cold, hard resolve. She had poured her inheritance into his fledgling company, Innovate Dynamics, a decade ago. A silent partner, her name on the initial incorporation documents, but long forgotten in the company's glossy corporate narrative. Richard had built the empire, yes, but it was on her foundation. And what the foundation supports, it can also reclaim. She took a sip of her decaffeinated coffee, the taste bitter on her tongue. Her phone lay on the marble countertop, a sleek black rectangle holding the key to her plan. For the past 3 weeks, while Richard was working late or on business trips, Eleanor had been working too. She had been in contact with Arthur Sterling, the family lawyer who had managed her father's estate, a man who knew where every financial body was buried. Together, they had been quietly, meticulously preparing for war. The penthouse door chimed, a soft, melodic sound that signaled Richard's return. The walk of shame, he probably thought. Eleanor smoothed down her dress, her expression carefully neutral. The actress took her final bow. She had to play her part just a little longer. When he walked in, looking disheveled but smug, she would be the concerned, slightly naive, pregnant wife. He would have no idea that the woman standing before him was no longer the curator of his beautiful life, but the architect of his downfall. The silence of the penthouse was about to be broken, and the sound would be the crash of an empire. Richard Hayes felt the familiar thrum of power as his private elevator ascended, a silent, swift climb to his personal Olympus. The city was his, a concrete and glass testament to his own brilliance. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, the faint ache in his temples, a dull reminder of the expensive scotch and even more expensive company he'd kept last night. Chloe. Her laughter still echoed in his ears, a sound as intoxicating as the single malt. She was everything Eleanor wasn't. Young, hungry, and utterly in awe of him. She didn't question his decisions or challenge his opinions. She looked at him like he was a god, and he was more than happy to play the part. Her apartment, a chic little shoebox in the village that he paid for, was his sanctuary from the quiet, judging eyes of his wife. With Chloe, life was simple, a series of transactional pleasures. He gave her a lifestyle she craved, and she gave him the adoration he deserved. He stepped out of the elevator and into the sterile opulence of the penthouse. The air was different up here, thinner, colder, just like Eleanor. He saw her standing by the window, a solitary figure against the sprawling cityscape. Her pregnancy, which should have been a symbol of his legacy, had become a source of irritation. It had made her emotional, needy. Her questions about his whereabouts, once subtle, had become more pointed. He'd had to work harder to lie, and it bored him. "Morning," he said, his voice a little rough. He loosened his tie, the knot feeling suddenly restrictive. Eleanor turned, her face a mask of placid calm. "You're home early." There was no accusation in her tone, just a simple statement of fact. It was more unnerving than if she had been screaming. "The deal in Tokyo closed faster than I expected," he lied smoothly, walking over to the espresso machine. The lie came easily, a well-worn path in his mind. "They signed everything overnight. It's a massive win for us." He needed the caffeine, a jolt to clear the lingering fog of Chloe and scotch. "That's wonderful, Richard," she said, her voice even. "You must be exhausted." He watched her in the reflection of the machine's polished chrome. She was looking at him, really looking at him, and for a moment he felt a flicker of unease. There was a stillness in her, a self-possession he hadn't seen in years. He dismissed it as a mood swing. "I'll live," he said, forcing a smile. "Nothing a few hours of sleep won't fix. How are you? How's the little guy?" He gestured vaguely towards her stomach. "We're fine," she said, "just enjoying the quiet." The word hung in the air between them. Quiet. It was a battlefield, and silence was her weapon of choice. He hated it. He preferred shouting. Drama, something he could fight and win. He couldn't win against this suffocating calm. Good, good, he mumbled, taking his espresso and downing it in one gulp. The bitter heat did little to quell his unease. He needed to get out, to get to the office, his real home, the place where he was king, where his word was law. "I have a board meeting at 10, he announced, moving towards the bedroom. "Just need a quick shower and a change of clothes." "Of course," Eleanor replied, turning back to the window. "Don't let me keep you." In the bedroom, he stripped off his suit, tossing the expensive fabric onto a valet chair. The faint scent of Chloe's perfume rose from the shirt, a ghost of his transgression. He sniffed it, a small, secret smile playing on his lips. He had it all: the brilliant, beautiful wife, the stunning, adoring mistress, the billion-dollar company. He was Richard Hayes, and the world bent to his will. He showered quickly, the hot water washing away the physical evidence of his infidelity, but not the smug satisfaction. He chose a power suit, a dark navy brioni, paired with a crisp white shirt and a silver tie, armor for the boardroom. As he was fixing his cufflinks, a small diamond-encrusted pair Eleanor had given him for their 5th anniversary, he noticed her father's old watch on the dresser. He usually wore a sleek, modern Audemars Piguet, but he'd worn the vintage piece to impress a potential investor who was an aficionado. He'd forgotten to switch them back. He picked it up, the leather strap worn and soft. A relic from a bygone era, from a man he'd ultimately surpassed. He walked back into the living area, feeling refreshed, invincible. Eleanor was still by the window, unmoving. "I'm off," he said, adjusting his tie. "Don't wait up. It's going to be a long day. We're celebrating the Tokyo deal tonight." "We," of course, meant him and Chloe. "Richard," she said, her voice stopping him at the door. He turned, impatient. "Yes?" "Be careful," she said softly. "It's a long way down." He frowned, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. What a strange, morbid thing to say. "I'll be fine, Elle. I always am." He gave her a perfunctory nod and walked out, the heavy door clicking shut behind him, sealing her in her gilded cage. He didn't give her another thought. He was already thinking about the board meeting, about the adulation of his team, and about the celebratory dinner he'd have with Chloe later. He had no idea that the cage door had just been unlocked, and it wasn't Eleanor who was the prisoner. It was him. The moment the penthouse door clicked shut, the carefully constructed dam of Eleanor's composure broke. Not in a flood of tears, but in a slow, deliberate release of pressure. A single, shuddering breath escaped her lips. She closed her eyes, leaning her forehead against the cool glass of the window. "It's a long way down." The words had been for him, but they were also for her. There was no turning back now. She walked over to the kitchen island, her movements precise, almost robotic. Her phone was there, waiting. Beside it lay the company tablet Richard had so carelessly left behind. For 3 weeks, it had been her secret obsession, a window into the rot that had infested her marriage. She had wanted to throw it against the wall, to shatter the screen that displayed such casual cruelty. But she hadn't. She had studied it, memorized it, used it. The first time she'd picked it up, she had been looking for the caterer's contact for a charity gala. Her thumb had brushed against the messages icon, and a notification had popped up. Chloe Vance. "Last night was incredible. Can't stop thinking about you." Her world had tilted on its axis. It wasn't just the words, but the sheer banality of the betrayal. It was happening on a device bought with company funds, in plain sight. She had scrolled back, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. Months of messages. Not just lust, but intimacy. They shared inside jokes. He complained to Chloe about Eleanor's moods. Chloe sent him fawning praise for his business acumen. They talked about a trip to the Maldives, a place Eleanor had always wanted to go. Once the Tokyo deal is done, Richard had written, we'll disappear for a week, just you and me. But the most damning evidence wasn't in the texts, it was in the files. Buried in a folder labeled personal, she found a draft of a pre-nuptial agreement. Not theirs. A new one. For him and Chloe. And in another subfolder, a series of financial projections for Innovate Dynamics, outlining a plan to dilute shareholder equity, including the significant, non-voting shares her initial investment had secured for her. He wasn't just planning to replace her in his bed, he was planning to erase her from the company's history, to steal the very foundation she had provided. That was the moment the ice in her chest had solidified into something sharp and dangerous. The affair was a deep wound, but the financial betrayal was a declaration of war. He saw her as a relic, a stepping stone to be discarded. He had underestimated her, and that was going to be his fatal mistake. She picked up her phone and dialed Arthur Sterling. The old lawyer answered on the first ring, his voice a gravelly comfort. "He's gone," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "Are you ready, my dear?" Arthur asked, a note of concern in his voice. He had known her since she was a child, had bounced her on his knee at her parents' garden parties. He was more of a father to her than her own had been in his final, detached years. "I am," she said. "Is everything in place?" "The proxies have been secured. The board members have been persuaded. Your father's old allies have long memories, Eleanor. They never trusted Richard. They were just waiting for a reason to act. You've given them one." Eleanor felt a pang of gratitude for her father. In his own emotionally distant way, he had protected her, even from beyond the grave. The shares he had left her in various allied tech firms were the leverage she needed. These were the men Richard had dismissed as old money, dinosaurs of a bygone era. But these dinosaurs had teeth. "The final piece of the puzzle is the holding company," Arthur continued. "The transfer of your shares into the newly formed EH Holdings was finalized this morning. As of 8 a.m. Eastern Time, you are the majority stakeholder in a company that now holds a controlling interest in Innovate Dynamics." Eleanor sank onto a stool, a wave of dizziness washing over her. EH Holdings. Eleanor Hayes Holdings. It had a nice ring to it. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Now, we let him walk into the boardroom. The meeting is scheduled for 10. At 10:15, I will personally walk in and present the board with the new ownership structure and the vote of no confidence. You, my dear, have a different appointment." Eleanor looked at the calendar on the wall. A red circle was drawn around today's date. 11 a.m. Dr. Evans. Her 24-week ultrasound. The first time she would see her son's face. "Thank you, Arthur," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." "Your father would be proud, Eleanor. He always said you had a spine of steel. You just needed a reason to show it." After she hung up, she sat in the silence, the tablet still glowing on the counter. She opened the messages one last time, looking at the digital ghost of her marriage. There was no sadness left, only a profound sense of clarity. Richard had built his empire on a foundation of lies, using her love and her money as his primary materials. Today, she was repossessing the property. She stood up and walked to her bedroom, leaving the tablet behind. She didn't need it anymore. She had all the proof she needed. She dressed carefully for her appointment, choosing a simple, elegant navy dress. As she looked at her reflection, she saw not the betrayed wife, but a woman on the verge of becoming. She placed a hand on her belly. a silent promise to the life within. "I will build a better world for you," she thought. "A world built on truth, not deception." She picked up her purse, took one last look at the opulent penthouse that had been her prison, and walked out. She didn't look back. She had a future to build, and it started today. Arthur Sterling sat in his leather-bound chair, the scent of old books and fresh coffee filling his wood-paneled office. The view from his window was of St. Patrick's Cathedral, a testament to enduring faith and intricate design, much like the legal frameworks he so admired. He looked at the documents spread across his mahogany desk, a fortress of paper that would, in a matter of hours, change the landscape of the tech world. But his thoughts were not on the corporate maneuvering. They were on Eleanor. He remembered the day she had first walked into his office 3 weeks ago. She hadn't been crying. Her eyes were dry, her expression a mask of cold fury that he recognized instantly. It was the same look her father, a ruthless but principled businessman, used to get before a hostile takeover. She had placed the tablet on his desk without a word and simply said, "I want to ruin him." Arthur, who had seen his share of bitter divorces among the city's elite, had initially counseled caution. "Eleanor, we can file for divorce, secure your assets, take him for every penny he's worth in a settlement. It will be clean, efficient." "Clean," she had echoed, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "There is nothing clean about this, Arthur. He didn't just cheat on me. He was planning to erase me, to steal my legacy. A settlement is not enough. I don't want his money. I want his company." The audacity of it had taken him aback. But as she laid out the details she had uncovered, the plan to dilute her shares, the sheer arrogance of his betrayal, Arthur felt a familiar fire ignite within him. It was a battle of principle, a fight against the kind of corporate hubris he despised. Richard Hayes was a new money shark who thought history didn't matter, that loyalty was a liability. It was time for a lesson. "It's possible," he had said slowly, his legal mind already racing through the possibilities, "but it will be a war. Are you prepared for that?" "I'm pregnant, Arthur," she had replied, her hand instinctively going to her belly. "I've been preparing for war for months." And so, the architect of redemption had gone to work. His first calls were to the dinosaurs, men who sat on the boards of a dozen companies whose wealth was old, quiet, and deeply interconnected. They were men who had done business with Eleanor's father, who valued handshakes and honor as much as contracts. Arthur didn't have to say much. He presented them with the evidence of Richard's plan to dilute the shares, a move that would have marginally affected them but deeply insulted their sense of fair play. He told them Eleanor, her father's daughter, was making a move. That was enough. Proxies were pledged, support was guaranteed. The second phase was the creation of EH Holdings, a shell corporation, perfectly legal, designed to be a vessel. They had to move quickly and quietly, transferring Eleanor's assets, including her original, substantial block of Innovate Dynamics shares, into this new entity. It was a complex series of transactions, a paper trail designed to be invisible until the moment of impact. Arthur had used his best people, forensic accountants, and corporate lawyers who could dance through loopholes the way ballerinas danced through Swan Lake. Now, it was all done. The trap was set. He looked at the clock on his wall. 9:45 a.m. Richard Hayes would be walking into his boardroom, smug and self-assured, ready to celebrate a victory he hadn't truly earned. He would have no idea that he was not the king in his castle, but the guest of honor at his own execution. Arthur took a sip of his coffee. He felt a sense of grim satisfaction. This wasn't just about revenge for Eleanor. It was about a restoration of order. Richard and his kind were disruptors, but they lacked the one thing that men of her father's generation understood implicitly, that empires built on sand, no matter how glittering, could not stand. The foundation was everything, and Eleanor was, and always had been, the foundation. His intercom buzzed. "Mr. Sterling, your car is ready." "Thank you, Margaret," he replied. He stood up, his joints creaking slightly, and gathered the documents into a pristine leather briefcase. He adjusted his silk tie and straightened his suit jacket. It was time. He was no longer just a lawyer. He was an instrument of fate, the hand that would pull the lever on the guillotine. As he walked out of his office, he allowed himself a small, thin smile. It was going to be a beautiful day. Meanwhile, miles away, Eleanor sat in the quiet waiting room of her obstetrician's office. The soft classical music and muted colors were designed to be calming, but her heart was hammering against her ribs. She wasn't thinking about the board meeting or the corporate coup. She was thinking about the life inside her. She picked up a parenting magazine from the table, its glossy pages filled with smiling mothers and cherubic babies. It felt like a dispatch from another universe. A nurse called her name. "Eleanor Hayes?" She stood up, her legs feeling unsteady. In the examination room, the technician was warm and professional. "Ready to see the little one?" she asked, her voice gentle. Eleanor nodded, her throat too tight to speak. As the technician moved the ultrasound wand over her belly, a grainy, black and white image appeared on the screen. A tiny, perfect profile, a small hand reaching up towards a face she couldn't yet see clearly, and then a sound, a strong, steady, rhythmic beat. Thump, 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 her son's heartbeat. In that moment, the noise of her life, the betrayal, the anger, the revenge, faded away. There was only that sound, the sound of the future, the sound of a love so pure and powerful it eclipsed everything else. Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent. They were not tears of sadness or of anger. They were tears of profound, unadulterated love. This was why she was fighting. Not just to punish Richard, but to protect this, to build a world for her son based on strength, integrity, and truth. He would know who his mother was, not a victim, not a scorned wife, but a queen who had taken back her kingdom for him. The empire would be his, but it would be an empire with a soul. The boardroom at Innovate Dynamics was Richard's cathedral. It was a masterpiece of corporate minimalism, a sleek expanse of glass and brushed steel on the 95th floor. The view was even more commanding than from his penthouse, a 270-degree panorama that made him feel like the master of the universe. He took his seat at the head of the long, obsidian table, a king upon his throne. His board members, a collection of venture capitalists and tech industry veterans, filed in, greeting him with deferential smiles and hearty handshakes. They were all here to celebrate. The Tokyo deal was a game-changer, securing their dominance in the Asian market for years to come. "Richard, congratulations," said Mark Chen, a Silicon Valley legend who had been an early investor. "Another home run." "We're just getting started, Mark," Richard said, his smile radiating confidence. He felt invincible. The scotch from last night was a distant memory, replaced by the pure adrenaline of success. He glanced at the empty chair to his right, reserved for the company's legal counsel. His lawyer was stuck in traffic, according to a text, but it didn't matter. This was a victory lap, not a negotiation. The meeting began at 10 o'clock sharp. Richard launched into his presentation, his voice smooth and commanding. He walked the board through the finer points of the Tokyo deal, his words painting a picture of unparalleled growth and limitless potential. The numbers were staggering, the projections astronomical. He was at the top of his game, a maestro conducting a symphony of success. He felt a surge of pity for Eleanor, stuck in their silent apartment, her world shrinking while his expanded exponentially. She would never understand this feeling, this raw, unadulterated power. At precisely 10:15, the boardroom doors opened. Richard paused mid-sentence, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. He hated interruptions. He expected to see his lawyer, flustered and apologetic. Instead, he saw Arthur Sterling. Arthur stood in the doorway for a moment, a figure from another era in his impeccably tailored Savile Row suit. He held a leather briefcase in one hand, his expression grim and unreadable. The mood in the room shifted instantly. The celebratory atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a tense, confused silence. "Arthur," Richard said, his voice tight, "this is a private meeting. What are you doing here?" "I'm here on behalf of the majority stakeholder of this company," Arthur said, his voice calm, but carrying an undeniable weight of authority. He walked into the room, his footsteps echoing on the polished concrete floor. He placed his briefcase on the table with a soft, definitive thud. A ripple of murmurs went through the board members. Richard stared at him, a cold knot of dread beginning to form in his stomach. This made no sense. He was the majority stakeholder. "I think you're mistaken," Richard said, forcing a laugh. "I own 51% of this company." "Not anymore," Arthur said, opening his briefcase. He began to distribute a set of bound documents to each board member. As of 8 o'clock this morning, a newly formed entity, EH Holdings, acquired a controlling interest in Innovate Dynamics, holding a combined 53% of all voting shares. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. EH Holdings? It sounded vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place it. He looked at the document Arthur placed in front of him. It was a detailed breakdown of the new ownership structure. He saw Eleanor's original shares he had dismissed as insignificant, now combined with shares from a dozen other entities, including several held by the very men sitting at this table. He looked up, his eyes darting from Mark Chen to the others. Their faces were impassive, their gazes averted. They knew. They were in on it. "This is impossible," Richard stammered, his voice a hoarse whisper. "This is illegal." "I assure you, it is perfectly legal," Arthur said coolly. "The proxies are all in order. The transactions were vetted by the best legal minds in this city. You, Richard, are no longer in control of this company." The room was silent, the only sound the frantic beating of Richard's own heart. His cathedral had become his tomb. He felt a wave of vertigo, the panoramic view outside the window suddenly seeming menacing, a vast emptiness waiting to swallow him whole. "And who," Richard choked out, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, "is EH Holdings?" Arthur allowed himself a small, cold smile. He looked directly at Richard, his eyes like chips of ice. "Eleanor Hayes Holdings," he said, letting the name hang in the air like a death sentence. "The company is now under the control of its founder, your wife." The shock hit Richard like a physical blow. Eleanor, it was impossible. His quiet, docile, pregnant wife. The woman he had cheated on, lied to, and was planning to discard. She had done this. She had orchestrated this silent, brutal coup. The gaslighting, the paranoia, the hormones, it had all been an act. A brilliant, devastating act. "Furthermore," Arthur continued, his voice cutting through Richard's stunned silence, "as my first act representing the new majority owner, I am calling for a vote of no confidence in the current CEO, Richard Hayes, on the grounds of gross mismanagement and fiduciary negligence." He didn't need to say anything else. Richard looked around the table, at the faces of the men who had been clapping him on the back just minutes before. He saw no sympathy, no support, only the cold, hard calculus of business. He had been outplayed, outmaneuvered, and utterly destroyed. The view from Olympus was breathtaking, but he had forgotten one crucial thing. Even gods can be overthrown, and his fall from grace was just beginning. While the foundations of Richard's world were crumbling, Eleanor was in a different kind of sanctuary. The ultrasound room, with its dim lighting and the steady, rhythmic sound of her son's heartbeat, was a world away from the corporate carnage she had unleashed. She watched the grainy, miraculous image on the screen, her hand resting on her belly, feeling the faint flutters of life within. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace. The storm of anger and betrayal had passed, leaving behind a profound, quiet strength. She had done what she had to do, not for revenge, but for survival, for her son. She would not have him born into a world built on his father's lies. He would be born into an empire of his mother's making, an empire she would rebuild with integrity and purpose. After the appointment, she didn't go back to the penthouse. She couldn't. It was a place of ghosts, a monument to a life that was now over. Instead, she had her driver take her to the Carlisle, the timeless Upper East Side hotel where she had stayed with her mother as a child. She checked into a suite overlooking Central Park, the familiar old-world elegance a soothing balm to her frayed nerves. She ordered tea and a light lunch, and for the first time in weeks, she felt hungry. As she ate, she allowed herself to think about the future. It was a daunting, terrifying, and exhilarating prospect. She was about to become the CEO of a billion-dollar tech company in a male-dominated industry where she would be scrutinized and second-guessed at every turn, and she was about to become a single mother. Could she do it? The question echoed in the quiet of the suite. The old Eleanor, the one who had sublimated her own ambitions for her husband's, would have said no, but that Eleanor was gone, burned away in the fire of betrayal. The woman who remained was someone new, someone forged in crisis. She was her father's daughter, with his strategic mind and his iron will, and she was her mother's daughter, with her grace, her intuition, and her fierce, protective love. She was a combination of them both, and she was more than enough. Her phone buzzed, and she saw Arthur's name on the screen. She took a deep breath and answered. "It's done," he said, his voice laced with grim satisfaction. "How was he?" Eleanor asked, a flicker of the old, empathetic her surfacing for a moment. As expected, Arthur replied. Shock, disbelief, rage. He threatened lawsuits, investigations, retribution, the usual bluster of a king who has just been dethroned. The board was silent. They know which way the wind is blowing. He has been placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. Security is escorting him from the building as we speak. Eleanor closed her eyes, picturing the scene. Richard, the master of the universe, being walked out of his own building like a common criminal. There was no triumph in the image, only a profound sense of melancholy. What a waste! What a terrible, needless waste of it all. "What's the next step?" she asked, her voice all business now. "The board has scheduled an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning at 9, Arthur said. "They will formally accept your appointment as interim CEO. You will need to be there, Eleanor. You will need to address them, to lay out your vision for the company. This is your moment to lead." "I'll be there," she said, her voice steady. "Good," Arthur said. "Get some rest, my dear. You've won the war. Tomorrow, the hard work of winning the peace begins." After she hung up, Eleanor walked over to the window, looking down at the green expanse of Central Park. The city, which had once felt like a cage, now looked like a kingdom at her feet. She knew the road ahead would be difficult. The tech world would be skeptical. The media would have a field day with the story, Scorned Wife's Revenge. They would try to paint her as a vindictive shrew, an emotional woman unqualified to lead. They would underestimate her. And that, she thought with a small, determined smile, would be their fatal mistake, just as it had been Richard's. She thought about Chloe Vance, the other woman in this drama. She felt not anger, but a strange sort of pity. Chloe had hitched her wagon to a falling star, a man who saw her as nothing more than a shiny, disposable accessory. She wondered what would become of her now. That was a problem for another day. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from an unknown number. "I need to see you, please. It's Chloe." Eleanor stared at the message, her heart giving a sudden, hard jolt. She should ignore it, delete it, block the number. But she didn't. Some instinct, some sense of a narrative yet unfinished, made her pause. What could she possibly want? To plead for Richard? To apologize? To threaten? Against her better judgment, Eleanor typed a reply. "Where?" The answer came back instantly. A small, unassuming coffee shop in the West Village. A place where no one would recognize either of them. Eleanor knew she shouldn't go. It was a risk, a complication she didn't need. But she also knew she had to. To close this chapter, she had to face the ghost of her husband's betrayal, to look into the eyes of the woman who had been a willing participant in her pain. She needed to understand. She called for her driver. The Queen was about to meet the pretender to the throne, and only one of them would walk away with her dignity intact. The coffee shop was a small, dimly lit place with the scent of roasted beans and old books hanging in the air. It was the kind of anonymous, unassuming spot where secrets could be exchanged over chipped ceramic mugs. Eleanor chose a small table in the back corner, her back to the wall, a strategic position she chose without conscious thought. She was early, a habit ingrained in her by her father. Punctuality is the first sign of respect, Eleanor, for others and for yourself. She ordered a chamomile tea, her hands cupped around the warm mug, a small island of calm in the sea of her turmoil. She wasn't sure what to expect. A tearful confession? A defiant confrontation? She braced herself for either. Chloe Vance arrived exactly on time. She looked smaller in person, less formidable than the glamorous, confident woman in the photos on Richard's tablet. She was dressed in expensive-looking but understated clothes, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. She was just a girl, Eleanor realized with a jolt, a young, ambitious girl who had made a terrible, life-altering mistake. "Thank you for meeting me," Chloe said, her voice barely a whisper as she slid into the chair opposite Eleanor. She didn't order anything. She just sat there, twisting a napkin in her hands. Eleanor simply nodded, her expression neutral. She would not make this easy for her. She would not offer absolution. I know you must hate me," Chloe began, her voice trembling. "And you have every right to. What we did, was unforgivable." "Then why are you here?" Eleanor asked, her voice cool and even. Chloe looked up, her eyes pleading. "Because I need you to know that I didn't know. Not about the plan to take your shares, I swear it. Richard, he told me you two had an arrangement, that the marriage was over in all but name. He said your investment was just an old formality he was cleaning up. I never would have. If I had known he was stealing from you, Her voice broke, and she looked down at her shredded napkin. Eleanor listened, her gaze unwavering. She didn't know whether to believe her or not. It was plausible. Richard was a master manipulator, a convincing liar. He could have easily spun a tale that painted him as the victim, trapped in a loveless marriage. But Chloe was not entirely innocent. She had made a choice. You knew he was married, Eleanor stated, the simple fact a cold, hard stone between them. You knew he had a wife who was pregnant with his child. A sob escaped Chloe's lips. I know, she whispered, and I will regret that for the rest of my life. I was stupid. I was starstruck. He made me feel important, seen, and I let myself believe the fantasy. But it was all a lie. Yes, Eleanor said softly. It was. He's ruined, Chloe said, looking up again, a new, harder edge to her voice. When he found out, the things he said, the way he looked at me, as if I was somehow responsible. He called me. He said I was a distraction, a mistake that cost him everything. He threw me out of the apartment. He cancelled my credit cards. He told me I was fired. I have nothing. I have no one. The serpent, Eleanor realized, had been bitten by its own kind. Richard, in his rage and humiliation, had turned on the one person he could blame, the easiest target. He had discarded her as easily as he had planned to discard Eleanor. Why are you telling me this? Eleanor asked, her voice still devoid of emotion. Because I have something for you, Chloe said, reaching into her purse. She pulled out a small, slim USB drive and slid it across the table. Richard was careless. He used his company laptop for everything. Personal emails, financial records, everything. I was his executive assistant. I know all his passwords. I backed everything up. Eleanor stared at the small piece of plastic. It was a Trojan horse, a digital bomb. What's on it? She asked, her voice tight. Everything, Chloe said, her eyes dark. The real financials of the company, not the doctored ones he showed the board. Evidence of offshore accounts, deals he made that were unethical, illegal even. Enough to make sure he never works in this city or any other again. Enough to put him in prison. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. This was more than she had bargained for. She had wanted to reclaim her company, to secure her son's future. She had not set out to destroy Richard completely, to send him to jail. Why give this to me? Eleanor asked, her voice a whisper. Because he deserves it, Chloe said, her voice filled with a venom that startled Eleanor. He used me. He used both of us. He built his empire on our backs, and he was going to throw us both away without a second thought. I won't let him get away with it. And maybe it's a way to atone, to do one right thing after doing so many wrong ones. Eleanor looked from the USB drive to Chloe's face. She saw not a manipulative homewrecker, but a fellow victim, a woman who, like her, had been blinded by a charismatic man's ambition. They were not friends. They would never be friends. But in that moment, they were allies, bound by the common enemy who had wronged them both. Eleanor picked up the USB drive, its cool metal a stark contrast to the warmth of her teacup. It felt heavy in her hand, heavy with the weight of another person's future. Thank you, Eleanor said, and she meant it. Chloe stood up, her shoulders slumped. I'm leaving New York, she said, going home to Ohio. I'm going to try to start over. She gave Eleanor a sad, wry smile. I guess in a way, you've given me that chance. You showed me what a strong woman really looks like. She turned and walked out of the coffee shop, disappearing into the anonymous city streets, a ghost of a life that Eleanor had once known. Eleanor sat for a long time, the USB drive clutched in her hand. She had a choice to make. She could use it, unleash the full force of the law on Richard and obliterate him completely, or she could hold it, a silent weapon, a guarantee that he would never trouble her or her company again. She thought about her son. What kind of world did she want him to inherit? One built on vengeance, or one built on mercy? She didn't know the answer yet, but she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that the choice was hers to make. She was no longer a pawn in anyone's game. She was the queen, and the next move was hers. The emergency board meeting was held in the same room where Richard's reign had so spectacularly ended. But today, the atmosphere was different. The tension was gone, replaced by a quiet, nervous anticipation. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, in the chair that had once been her husband's. It felt right. She was not an imposter. She was a founder, reclaiming her rightful place. She was dressed in a simple but elegant black maternity dress, her hair pulled back in a severe professional chignon. She looked every inch the leader. She had spent the previous night preparing, studying the company's real financials, the ones Chloe had given her, and formulating a plan. She was not just here to be a figurehead, she was here to lead. She addressed the board, her voice clear and steady, without a hint of the nervousness she felt inside. She did not mention Richard. She did not speak of betrayal or revenge. She spoke of the future. She laid out her vision for Innovate Dynamics, a vision that went beyond just profit margins and market share. She spoke of ethical innovation, of corporate responsibility, of creating a company culture based on transparency and respect. She spoke of returning to the core values on which the company had been founded, values that had been lost in the relentless pursuit of growth at any cost. The board members, the dinosaurs, and the venture capitalists alike listened intently. They had expected a grieving, vengeful wife. They had not expected a visionary leader. They saw in her not the reflection of her husband's ambition, but the echo of her father's wisdom. When she was finished, there was a moment of silence, and then, led by Mark Chen, they began to applaud. "Welcome, Madam CEO," Mark said, a genuine smile on his face. "We're with you." The vote to install her as interim CEO was unanimous. The first battle was won. Later that day, she returned to the penthouse. She had to. It was still her home, and she needed to pack, to retrieve the pieces of her old life before she could fully step into her new one. She had expected to find it empty, but he was there. Richard was sitting on the floor in the middle of the vast living room, surrounded by shattered glass. He had swept the contents of a bookshelf onto the floor, books, awards, framed photos, and he was staring into the wreckage of his life. He was unshaven, his expensive suit rumpled, his eyes hollow. He looked like a king in exile, a man who had lost not just his kingdom, but his very identity. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a raw, broken whisper. He didn't seem surprised to see her. She stood by the door, her hand resting on her belly, a silent barrier between them. She felt no fear, only a deep, aching sadness. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice filled with a weary resignation. "Have you come to gloat, to watch me bleed?" "No, Richard," she said softly. "I've come to pack." He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Of course. You've taken my company, my reputation, my life. Why not take the furniture too?" "They were never yours to begin with," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "The company was built on my money. Your reputation was built on my grace. Your life was built on my love. You were a careless steward of it all." He looked up at her then, and for the first time, she saw not arrogance or anger, but a flicker of genuine soul-crushing despair. "I loved you, Elle," he whispered. "In my own, broken way, I did." "I know," she said, and the words were true. "But your ambition was a sickness, Richard. It consumed everything good in you. It consumed us." She walked past him, into their bedroom, and began to pack a suitcase. She moved with a calm efficiency, folding clothes, gathering toiletries, the mundane actions a strange counterpoint to the epic drama of their lives. He followed her, standing in the doorway, watching her. "What now?" he asked. "Are you going to send me to prison? I know she went to you. Chloe. I know she would have taken everything." Eleanor paused, her back to him. She held a tiny, white baby grow in her hand, a gift from her mother. She turned to face him, the USB drive from her purse in her other hand. She held it up for him to see. "I have everything, Richard," she said, her voice even. "Enough to ensure you spend the next decade behind bars. And there is a part of me, a very large part, that wants to do just that. The part of me that you wounded so deeply." He flinched, his eyes fixed on the small piece of plastic that held his doom. "But then," she continued, her voice softening, "I think about our son. And I ask myself what I want for him. Do I want him to grow up visiting his father in prison? Do I want his life to be defined by your crimes, by my revenge?" She walked towards him, stopping just a few feet away. "I am not going to destroy you, Richard. You have done that to yourself. I am going to give you a choice. You can disappear. You can sign over your remaining shares to a trust for our son. You can agree to never contact me or the company again, and you can take what money you have left and build a new life somewhere far away from here. Or I can give this to the district attorney." She held out the USB drive. "The choice is yours." He stared at her, his mind reeling. Mercy. It was the last thing he expected. It was a gift he did not deserve. He saw in her eyes not the woman he had betrayed, but the woman he had once loved, a woman of incredible strength and grace. He saw the mother of his child. Slowly, with a trembling hand, he reached out, but he didn't take the drive. Instead, his fingers brushed against hers, a fleeting ghost of a touch. "Thank you," he whispered, and a single tear traced a path through the stubble on his cheek. It was the first time she had ever seen him cry. He turned and walked away, out of the bedroom, out of the penthouse, and out of her life. Eleanor stood for a moment, the USB drive still in her hand. Then, she walked over to the window and opened it, the sounds of the city rushing in. With a flick of her wrist, she threw the drive out into the open air. It tumbled end over end, a tiny, insignificant thing, before disappearing into the vastness of the city below. She had won. But more than that, she had been merciful. She had chosen not to become the monster he had been. She had chosen to be the mother her son deserved. She closed the window, took her suitcase, and walked out of the penthouse for the last time, leaving the ashes of her old life behind. The future was waiting. 6 months later, Eleanor Hayes stood in the bright, airy corner office that had once been Richard's. It was barely recognizable. The dark, imposing furniture was gone, replaced by a clean, modern aesthetic of light wood and soft grey fabrics. On the walls, where Richard's self-congratulatory awards had once hung, there was now a curated collection of art by emerging female artists. The room was no longer a monument to a single ego, but a space for collaboration and inspiration. From the window, the city sprawled below. No longer a beast to be conquered, but a community to be a part of. Eleanor, her newborn son Leo, asleep in a bassinet by her desk, looked out at the view with a sense of profound peace. She had not just saved Innovate Dynamics, she had transformed it. Under her leadership, the company had a new mission. They were still innovators, still pushing the boundaries of technology, but now with a conscience. She had launched the Innovate for Good Foundation, a charitable arm of the company dedicated to using their technology to solve real-world problems, from providing augmented reality tools for surgeons in developing countries to creating educational software for underprivileged children. The company was more profitable than ever, but it was a success that felt clean, earned. She had proven her doubters wrong. The media, which had initially pounced on the salacious story of her takeover, now wrote glowing profiles of the visionary female CEO who was changing the face of tech. Her employees, initially wary, were now fiercely loyal. She led not with fear and intimidation as Richard had, but with empathy, integrity, and a clear, unwavering vision. She had heard whispers about Richard. He had moved to a small coastal town in California, living a quiet, anonymous life. He had honored their agreement, signing over his shares to Leo's trust and disappearing completely. She hoped for his sake and for their sons that he had found some measure of peace. She had chosen mercy not for him, but for herself, and for the son who now slept so peacefully beside her. She would not be bound to Richard by hatred. She had set them both free. There were hard days, of course, days when the loneliness of being a single mother and a high-powered CEO felt overwhelming. But then she would look at Leo, at his tiny, perfect face, and she would remember why she was doing this. She was building a legacy for him, an empire founded not on sand, but on a bedrock of strength, honor, and love. The intercom on her desk buzzed. "Ms. Hayes, Mark Chen is here to see you." "Send him in, Sarah," she replied. Mark walked in, his face beaming. "Eleanor, the first quarter numbers are in. We're not just stable, we're soaring. The market loves the new direction. The world loves it." "The world was ready for a change," Eleanor said, a small smile playing on her lips. Mark looked over at the sleeping baby. "And how's the new CEO?" he asked, his voice soft. "He's perfect," Eleanor said, her heart swelling with a love so fierce it almost hurt. "He's my why." As Mark left, Eleanor walked over to the bassinet and looked down at her son. She gently stroked his soft cheek, a silent promise passing between them. The glass empire of her past was shattered, its pieces swept away. In its place, she was building something new, something stronger, something real. And this time, the foundation was unbreakable. This was a story of a woman who turned betrayal into triumph, transforming the ashes of a broken marriage into an empire with a soul. If you were moved by Eleanor's journey from a silenced wife to a powerful CEO, please give this story a like and share it with others who appreciate tales of strength, resilience, and redemption. Don't forget to subscribe for more emotionally charged fiction that explores the complexities of the human heart. What part of Eleanor's story resonated with you the most? Let us know in the comments below.